With about 2 weeks to go before the UK holds a referendum over whether or not to remain a part of the EU, battle lines are being drawn about which side is right. Like any grey area subject, the reality is a lot more nuanced than the arguments would suggest. In this case, though, people have to make a choice. Which side do we gamble our future with? Before I go any further, obviously, if you're in the UK and eligible to vote, vote. I mean, I know I have my preference. It may or may not be the same as yours. But that isn't what matters. This is one of those opportunities that, you have to take it. Vote for what you think is right. Look at the worst case scenario. If your side doesn't get through, do you really want it to be because there was a low turnout and you wonder if the reality was represented or not? Similarly, if your side wins, do you want people saying, well, there was a crappy turnout, so, it wasn't what people really wanted? This matters. More important than what the result is, it matters that the result is representative of what the UK as a whole is interested in. Yes, obviously, like I said, I've got my preference, but, if it's gone against, I'd rather it's because I'm in the minority, not because most people couldn't be asked voting. The problem is, when you get down to the subjects at hand, like anything politically charged, well, anything charged really, people will believe what they want to believe. The side that promises to scratch their personal itch, regardless of how true or not the argument is. People don't want uncomfortable truths, they just want what they want to hear. You work in IT support long enough, you sort of get that idea, people will trust their mate who knows a bit about computers if they say something different to what your IT team's saying. If your IT team is saying something that, isn't what you want to hear about how you use the computer, a lot of people are more likely to listen to what their friend outside of the organisation would say, regardless of whether or not that friend knows how things are set up there. Popular opinion, not always truth, and what suits you personally may not be best for the bigger picture. Of course there are costs involved in being part of the EU. Of course there are compromises that we have to make whilst a part of the EU. Similarly, of course there will be costs involved in leaving, if we end up leaving, and there will probably be compromises to be made there too. The difference is which costs and compromises and how much say does the UK have, or at least how much say do our politicians have in those decisions. And that's where this all comes down to. The thing that worries me most is that those in favour of leaving don't seem to acknowledge that there are any costs involved at all. It's all going to be sunshine and roses, and anyone who says otherwise is scaremongering. And all I have to say is, do you know the first thing about change? Have you ever been through house moves, company restructures, office relocations, or migrations to a new hardware or software platform? Or have you been involved in either organising or assisting in those? I have, several times. Change is never smooth. It's never straightforward. Even when there's long-term gain, there's always a bit of short-term pain, and you have to know what those things are. Otherwise, something that is a problem but is easy enough to be dealt with if you're aware of it can completely blindside you and cause more of an issue than it could. And similarly, when you're trying to figure out change on any scale, You know, you have to look at what the risks are. However unlikely they are, you've still got to look at what the potential risks are, how likely or unlikely those risks are, and how best to mitigate and manage them. The thing that worries me about the Leave campaigns at the moment is that no one seems to be admitting that there are any risks. So I don't know how they're going to manage or mitigate the things which could well go wrong because nothing goes smoothly. You know, things will never go smoothly. That's just the way it is. It's just how well you manage them. I don't know how well they're going to manage them because a lot of them don't want to admit that there are any problems. The other thing is, what will the knock-on effects be? You know, I'm pretty certain that if we end up leaving, and even if we don't, if the vote is close enough, but especially if we do end up leaving, other European countries, you know, they've all got, you know, their political groups who'd be, you know, more interested in leaving. You know, what's going to happen to their next elections? Are those parties going to get in control? Will there be other referendums? What's then going to happen? And whether or not leaving is right or wrong, do we really want to be the first? Do we want to be the guinea pigs, the test subjects, well, we've not done this before and we'd never really considered that anybody was going to leave, so we've sort of been making it up as we go along. And, you know, in a decade or two's time when, you know, the third or fourth country's leaving, it's like they got it to a fine art and they have it handled better. And, you know, that's the thing. Yes, as you've probably figured, I'm personally in favour of remaining in the EU. But if we end up leaving, I want it to be managed well. I don't want it to be a fucking rush job, which is sort of what I'm scared that it's going to be. The other thing is, and you know, this is a valid point that the people in favour of leaving the EU will bring up, that, you know, we will not be beholden to all aspects of EU law. You know, there are things that are decided in Europe that all member states have to adhere to, and sometimes those align with what we'd ideally like to do ourselves, and sometimes those don't. And, you know, upon leaving, we get to cherry pick the best. But which bits do we lose? Which bits do we keep? Who decides? Well, it'll be the politicians who decide, and which bits will they keep? You know, we've already got, I believe Theresa May has gone on record as saying that, you know, she'd rather that we were able to make our own decisions on human rights rather than, you know, going by, you know, the European human rights laws, which aren't to do with the EU, but it's the same sort of concept. It's like, oh, this thing which is supposed to be, you know, in the interest of everybody, regardless of who they are and where they are, and to make sure that people get treated fairly, we actually want to be able to decide who we treat fairly and how unfairly we get to treat everybody else. If they're a nasty person, we want to make the decisions, and we shouldn't be beholden on other people saying, but that's not very nice, really. And that's sort of what it comes down to. You know, all, you know, the political, the financial sides of things, a lot of it seems to be that, you know, I suspect that some things would get lost. I mean, you know, the current Tory government, do we really, really want them choosing workers' rights? You know, stuff like, you know, working hours and, you know, annual leave, excuse me, you know, maternity leave, you know, and rights on hiring and firing and all that kind of stuff. A lot of that we get from the EU. I mean, yes, we wouldn't have to give it up if we left, but would the decision makers really want to keep it? I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. The other thing is, obviously, we leave the EU, we've got to renegotiate trade deals, with the rest of Europe and the rest of the world, because, we'll be our own entity rather than a part of Europe. And, obviously, to us, to the UK, it would be our top priority. How high will it rate on other countries' priority lists, though? Especially if us leaving leads to the possibility of other countries wanting to leave, there's going to be a lot of people, thinking, I think, in terms of that. I mean, yes, we might be, say, negotiating directly with Europe rather than the individual member states, but then if we leave and then that ultimately causes someone else to leave, then we've got to renegotiate with them down the line, and then the next ones, and the next ones, and then, if, Europe is kind of looking at its overall stability and stuff, how much is it really going to be wanting to pay attention to the upstarts who basically set all this crap in motion? And what about the rest of the world? What about on a global scale? What effect is this going to have? Because it will have an effect outside of our borders. And I know a lot of the people seem to want to leave because they want to concentrate what's more going on inside of our borders, but other countries are going to be doing likewise. There's a lot of that in the world at the moment anyway. And, well, who's going to want to play nice with the people who upset the apple cart? I'm not entirely sure many people will. And, the other thing is peace and stability. I mean, as a general rule, we've had about 70 years worth of peace in Europe. I mean, yeah, there's been, bits of disagreements and stuff, and, probably some fairly major ones, but we've not had a war that spilled out across Europe or involved the rest of the world for about 70 years. And that, large-scale wars across Europe seem to be, well, the gap seems to be a bit of an anomaly. And in part, I think it's because of the European Union. I mean, okay, yes, maybe a lot of the time it feels like one massive family argument and people are all squabbling over, who gets to do what. But, better everyone squabbling over who gets what rather than everyone having a punch-up as to who gets what. And I think, again, that's some of the advantage that we get to being a part of Europe and having a stable Europe, in that, okay, yes, there are some times when it feels like an uneasy truce. But an uneasy truce is still a fucking truce. And again, that's one of the things that worries me, in that, things will fall apart. Everyone will be disagreeing. No one will be agreeing with things, and tensions will get high. And I don't know, I just see... I mean, put it this way. We're in the information age now. Borders are in some ways less of an issue than they used to be. But yet there are so many countries who are all trying to build extra walls. Everyone's scared of closer integration. But surely war and terrorism and stuff like that shows that actually too many divisions are bad. And, here we are wanting to add more divisions. I don't know. And the other thing is, just look at us, look at the UK, look at what we are. Ultimately, we're a small island nation. We're separated from our nearest neighbours, the continental Europe, by a small amount of distance, and the sea, and a large language barrier. We're separated from other English-speaking nations, like America and Australia, by a large amount of distance, and a smaller language barrier. But we are apart from the world already. We're lucky that we have a large amount of influence, but how much of that comes from being a part of Europe? how much of that from the English speaking world maybe comes from being an English speaking entry into Europe, and how much will people give a shit about as if we're not that anymore? You know, the world has changed. I mean, everyone seems to think that we used to do better when we could make our own decisions. Well, I'm not entirely sure that was the case. I mean, ultimately, when you get down to it, anybody who's not my local council hasn't necessarily got my best interests in mind. At least at local council level, politics actually gives a bit of a damn about, what housing's like in the area, what the roads are like in the area, what crime's like in the area, what works well for here. As soon as you're starting looking further afield, it doesn't really matter whether it's London or whether it's Brussels or whether it's bloody Washington. Those people making the decisions don't really know what's going outside my window. They don't know what's going out down your road. They don't know what affects your local situation. You've got to hope that the big picture lines up with, what works well for your area. But that's just as likely or unlikely in London as it is in Brussels. That's just the way it goes. And, ultimately it's, we're still in a position where it's politicians who make the decisions. Again, it's which bunch of politicians. And, yeah, if we choose to leave, we're taking a gamble that our lot having more direct control is better than our lot having to play nice with other people. And I don't know. There's just a part of me that thinks that that's a big if. We're gambling a hell of a lot. Because, like it or loathe it, the European Union is pretty much a known entity. At the very least, we know how things are at the moment. And, we can see general trends in where things are going to go. And not just the advantages, we know what the disadvantages are as well. We can see what they are, we can work around them when we're able to, we can work within them when we have to. But leaving, that's a complete unknown. And, I guess I'd be a lot less worried about the outcome in either direction if the Leave campaign was a bit more forthcoming with knowledge and plans and saying what could happen, what the risks are, how to mitigate them, what the ideas are, and, showing that they've got plans in motion, because at least then I'd know that regardless of which side it goes, we're probably in good hands. Because like I said, whatever happens, ultimately, once you cast your vote, it's out of your own hands, so it's all in someone else's. And right now, I trust the status quo a little bit more than I trust the unknown. And going forward, I mean, come on, I'm the guy, I'm the guy with a blog and a YouTube channel who watches American TV, British TV, Japanese animation, listens to Japanese music. It's like I have no problem with the world ultimately shrinking. Cultural identity is important because, without differences in culture, that's why that's how we end up with variety and interests. And, that's why I've got interests and contacts from all over the world. But, having all of your concerns just in one place? Really? In this day and age? I don't think so. I really don't. And what really worries me is that ultimately we will leave. It won't be handled as well as it could be. And at least for the foreseeable future, we get left behind. I'm gambling on other people's choices not wanting to freeze me out of the way the world is. But, as I said at the beginning, just bloody vote. You know, everyone's entitled to their own opinion. Make yours count. Make them all count. Whichever way things fall, make sure it's representative of what people really want. Because whichever way it goes, I want that level of certainty. And I suspect that even people in favour of leaving would want things to be definitively decided as well. So, yeah, cheerful times. And about 2 weeks to go. And yes, I'm scared of the future. And for me, that's really fucking rare. So until next time,